Okay. Hello, everyone. Welcome back to the Erasmus Expeditions. We are back with episode number 17, question mark. I believe that's right. And this is Help Action. This is one part topic discussion, one part Q&A, one part interview with the guest, where I have a person on and we discuss a certain topic, get to know them a little bit better, and get some questions from you guys. So today, our episode is all about pacing in your games. And I am very excited to welcome my guest, Nicolaas Dawson. Nico, how are you son of a bitch?
I'm well, thanks. Thanks for having me.
Absolutely. I'm really happy to have you on. We've had the chance to play with one another once, maybe twice before, and I really like your style and what you bring to games that you run, as well as the way you play. And one of the things that I have definitely noticed is that you and I tend to have very similar tastes in the pacing of a game. So I'm very excited to get you on in particular for this topic. This is one that I've been kind of mulling over for a while. But before we kind of get into that and open it up and get down to brass tacks, where can people find you if they're looking for you? What do you get up to?
I lurk about on the AbTab forum, and what videos I do run that get broadcast go up on my mate Lloyd's channel, which is YellDM, which you probably all subscribe to. If not, do that as well as subscribing to this. But that's where you can get my stuff, most of it.
Awesome. Yeah. You and Lloyd are thick as thieves.
We are.
Which is awesome. He's another fantastic player and a wonderful DM. I have had the chance to play with him much more frequently. He actually plays in one of my campaigns that I run here on the channel. So, anything else that I need to cover before we get started? I don't really think so. Pardon the green screen. I just went ahead and left it up. I'm going to be using it through the rest of the week, and I used it earlier to shoot some stuff for another video on the channel. But I don't have a program up currently that can do anything with it, so it's just going to sit there. So tonight we are talking about pacing. So maybe we should do something about that. There's a lot of preloaded questions that came in before this kind of kicked off. But if you do have a question, go ahead and post it in the chat over on the side there. Preface it with question, all in capitals, so that way it stands out a bit, and we'll throw it up here on the screen and get to it whenever we get the chance. So, Australia. That's like literally the other side of the world for me. So
what a world.
Yeah, right? Isn't this crazy that we can do stuff like this now? That we can connect with people, on the other side of the globe.
If different time zones to discuss the same obscure niche thing.
Absolutely. It's really kind of blown the top off of just basically any hobby, any kind of particular thing that somebody might be into, which is really cool. I know, I'm very lucky because I have a very close-knit circle of friends who are all players in my home group. And as I've gotten older, I realized that that's really not the case for a lot of people, that they have a hard time keeping groups together, and their circles of friends and players don't usually overlap, or if they do, it's only a really small percentage. But being able to find an online community that is as passionate about role-playing games as I am it's been a game changer for me.
Yeah, and for me, gone to like home games, really. Gone to beer and pretzels games from my life, and that time now goes into online games at weird hours, but like infinitely more enjoyable. For me, it's definitely blown the top off for what was just kind of like a latent interest into a focused one.
Yeah, I've always really liked the game, and we've played with my home group for years now, and we play on a weekly basis. But when we play at home, it's a lot more tactile and a lot more tactical. We play with miniatures and terrain, and there's a lot more focus on combat and characters' abilities and the way that you're your choices of feats and all of that kind of stuff comes together with a character. And I enjoy that side of gaming very much so, but there's not a lot of the emotional investment some of the time, especially not the kind that you can get from really heavy role play and story driven games that tend to kind of be more where the focus is for online gamers.
Yeah, I agree with that.
Well, that's awesome, man. So let's go ahead and dive in. Like I said, there's a whole bunch of questions that came in from the audience, and I have a few of my own that I'd like to get through. So one of the first things that I really like to start with is the question of where and when did you get started in the hobby? How did you find gaming?
I was share housing with a couple of mates, and one of them, he taught us D&D 3.5, and as a child played Baldur's Gate, like the video game, and so that and read those in like the Forgotten Realm novels. So I'd always kind of been sort of interested in that. But once we actually played it as like in our early 20s at uni, fell in love with it, but didn't really like the adventure that was run or his style. So I just started GMing and never stopped. So that was like 10 years ago. And so gone from just running home games, beer and pretzel stuff. And then a couple of years ago, stumbled across the OSG RIP, but then through it, AbTab, and have just like ceased really home games. Like I might play one occasionally with mates, like at a party or something, but it's all just online now. And I've don't get to have the tactical stuff and tactile stuff that you mentioned, but I had a lot of that over the last 10 years, a lot of like 8-hour sessions in the shed or down in the dungeon, and like weekends with like miniatures and roomy eyes. But now I kind of like the 3.5-hour intense online game. Though, yeah, obviously it lacks things that other mediums of the game have in abundance, but that's where I'm sitting at the moment.
Yeah, like I said, I really am very thankful that I kind of have the best of both worlds. I'm able to kind of get both of those itches scratched on a very regular basis. It's very good for my sanity. So that's awesome, man.
Oh, you still have positive sanity?
It depends on the week, but yeah, D&D certainly helps kind of balance that out.
Indeed.
So one of the things that I wanted to kind of bring up as an initial talking point is that I think there's a crucial step in order to understand pacing, and that's the ability to read the table, kind of knowing when the energy is either popping and things are really hot, or whenever they've kind of reached a lull. You don't want to push onward if everybody is really fully engaged in a scene or an encounter, but if the attention is starting to kind of wander and players are growing bored, reaching for their phones, etc., then it's definitely time to kind of nudge things along. Do you have any kind of particular tips or tricks to kind of gauge a table's temperature, if you will? How do you know when to push and when to let a scene kind of ride?
You can tell by like people's voice and like the luster with which they engage with like the stimulus presented to them, or if they're playing with webcam, like by their facial expression, or like chatter in the chat. So like keeping an eye on all of these amongst all of the other stuff you're doing when running a game is important for that. So you kind of have your finger on the pulse, and when a scene's lost its importance and the PCs like have nothing more to do after you've asked them, then just move it along. That's a good telling time to observe like pacing and move it along. Like when a player gives a statement or final pronouncement of something or asks a rhetorical question, that might be a good time to seize the initiative pacing wise and then move it along at that, rather than letting something letting it kind of carry on and dwindle from a more pivotal moment before ending the scene. Like kind of trust your instinct and get in there and seize it and push it along, especially like in a one shot. I think it's different in campaign. You can really let everything kind of play out without having to worry as much about pacing, but in a one shot it's key to just push it along. always be looking for that moment at the end of the scene to move it along. That being said, if the players are like talking and giving interesting dialogue, I'll just like popcorn and let that scene ride forever.
Yeah, very much so the same way. And I agree. One-shots are where you really have to be aware of pacing. Like you have to have it be forefront in your conscience all the time. Because if there is a scene that is starting to drag in a one-shot, you're wasting time. And you've got to figure out a way to push it over that hump and get it back into fast-paced. Now, again, if there's a dramatic scene that's playing out, absolutely do not interrupt that. As long as the tension is still high, that's great. But the moment that starts to ease off, that's when you absolutely have to cut it. Think about any movie or television television show that you've ever watched. And if you are conscious of kind of finding those beats in the ends of scenes in shows and movies that you watch, it becomes very easy to replicate that in your games, to kind of sense when those moments are upon you and jumping on it.
Yeah, I'd agree with that.
And I think the same thing goes for combat, honestly. There's a lot of times where, just like you said, where there's a pivotal moment, there's a climax to dialogue or to combat that happens, and everything after that is tapering off. So if you can end immediately after the point when the climax happens, then that's a much more impactful moment and scene for your players. So just like in a scene of dialogue in combat, it's the same way. Even if the monster still has extra hit points, if the person who has a character tie to this bad guy that they're fighting, and they hit a critical on them, but it doesn't get rid of their hit points, let it kill them, because that's the point when it's going to mean the most that the fight ends, not whenever they finally zing it with a magic missile and do 2 extra points and tip it over and kill it.
Yeah, I can respect that. That's not the way that I handle it, and I've copped feedback for that before, and that's like noted. But I kind of swing the other way on the last bit of that personally, and like the moment has to be worked for. If the dice are being rolled, then like that has to mean something for me. Otherwise,
Sure.
the slippery slope means I start like taking away that too much, more than I already do, perhaps. Yeah, so that's what I think on that.
Yeah, that's absolutely a fair point. And again, in a game that's more tactile, that's more strategic and focused on combat, then absolutely. It's, and there's a difference between killing it early with 2 extra hit points or 20 extra hit points. And I think it's all about, again, like most of the advice.
Reading the table.
Absolutely. It's all about the moment. If everybody's ready to move on with the combat, then yeah, like for me, it's I want to get this done. The combat has made its point and move on. But speaking of moving on, we'll go to our first question from the audience. So this one was actually asked a long time ago whenever I first started planning an episode about pacing. A good friend of mine in the channels, Karen Davies, asked, how do you know when to jump forward in time between sessions, or perhaps even during a session? When do you let your players experience downtime?
Pretty often, and I just would decide how to flash forwards in games, or how much time to go by, either by asking them by consensus in debrief after the session, or like just exercise GM agency and decide upon a time based on like what would cut through a lot of stuff that might not be as interesting, or that they might be as invested in, as when time makes way for the next event or point of interest to come up. And that's when that, like say 2-3 months or years or whatever that time goes by, is the big question to color in all that is, what do you want to do? What do you do with that downtime? And the players that I like to play with will have things they want to do with their time, rather than waiting to be like reactive to something that I present them with in that time. So I guess I'm kind of lucky in that I can, by kind of consensus and judgment, get that time to pass and still be meaningful and add to the story, like without having to spend, say, like a session 0.5 on it or something. And I'd be pretty open-handed to like things that are presented that the players want to do with their downtime beyond what their like mechanics might constrain.
So how would you deal with like a player who latches on to downtime really heavily and wants to have something very methodical and drawn out that would take multiple sessions to really kind of incorporate into the game?
I am that player. So in a hypothetical, I would treat that player well with bias. But I wouldn't want to spend other people's time at length on it. I'd be more agreeable to, like, just as a DM has to be, to communication outside the game and kind of hand waving what is either like boring or can be done without challenge or effort, so that the player gets these things that they want, and stuff that they either need the party for or that will be challenging to them or the party should be done in play, and that will become content for me to throw at the party. And it'll be good because it will mean more to the player because it's content being thrown in that they directly like have stakes in or can get benefit from. So that's how I deal with that player / I would welcome that player. Because if you have like a party of 4 and 2 or 3 of them are that player, as a DM after a couple of sessions, you don't have to like trawl for content to steal, to rip off or like think up stuff. You've just got content there being generated by players, and I think like that's the best stuff to use for players, like the stuff that their backstories are about, or that their arc is all about. Using that as the content is like a lazy, good way that I would tackle that.
Absolutely, yeah. I love taking what the players give me and trying to work it into what's going on, what's kind of been happening, and where things are going. And you're right. I mean, it absolutely, it just hooks them that much deeper and reels them in faster because it's something that they came up with initially.
Yep. Yeah, I think it's kind of essential. And if you expect players to be listening to the plots that you present or the plot hooks that you might arbitrarily give them, then in turn you have to be like nuanced with their motivations and goals. And it's kind of a win-win because using it means less prep time for you. Like they've probably already given you a backstory or a bit of a chat thing about it or mentioned it in RP during a session, and you can, half the job's done, like the villain might be there or the sage might be there or the this or the that or the quest item or whatever the thing is. It's right there from the player's wants.
Absolutely. And I love finding areas where I can take something that I might have had planned or thought out and something that they gave me and find a way to lay them over the top of each other and combine them into one thing. When that happens, I feel like a mad scientist. Okay, so there's a 2-part question from 2 different people. They're kind of related to one another. The first is from Caius Wallen, and he asks, is pacing also a player responsibility? Have you ever consciously changed the pace as a player?
Yes and yes. Cheaply, yes and yes. Every time.
Yeah.
Like any one shot I've ever played in, like where I'm playing a character that has agency, I would, like, more often than not, will seize some kind of initiative or step into a lull to get shit done or moving. And even in campaign play, I'm pretty hyperactive and ambitious generally. So I think factoring that stuff in is just kind of goes back to what we were saying before with being sensitive to the players.
Yeah, and I think it is absolutely It absolutely is something that a player should be aware of and be attempting to help with at the
Yep,
table.
it's everyone's responsibility in that sense.
Yeah, absolutely. And again, it's being a player at a table and a GM at a table. It's almost like you're actors in a scene, and you have to realize that the story that you're kind of putting forward is the play, the end product is more important than any individual character, and you have a part to play in the overarching thing, and realizing what part that is, where you stand in any given scene, usually can help with your understanding of what the pacing needs to be. Um, if you know that your character is getting their big moment, the moment that you've kind of been building up to throughout the campaign, then you know that the scene between you and the villain at the end, or the NPC that you've been chasing forever, is probably going to be a long, drawn out piece of dialogue. So if you're the kind of person that has difficulty coming up with that stuff on the fly, then have a few key phrases or ideas that you want to get across in that scene prepared ahead of time and set to the side. So that way you have something you can pull from whenever you're not really sure what to say or do.
Yeah, I agree with that. And Caius Wallen made a really good live video about this kind of stuff quite a while back in the AbTab forums about the responsibility of players outside of like the scene to provide certain narrative things and to be aware of duties, I guess, in a way, as far as having that kind of stuff prepared and thought about, so that everyone's working together to make the scene that's being described great for all.
Mm-hmm.
And yeah, that's part of the contract, just like before, like I was saying, we have the responsibility to incorporate their characters into everything and assist that, and it goes both ways.
Yeah, I agree. And again, like as a player, any way that you can help the GM is a great thing. The more prepared that you can be, the less that they have to worry about, and the less that they have to do in the moment. And
Yeah, that's a good. Sorry.
yeah. So please.
That's a good point. And meta, like to pacing, is just like is also a thing outside of like the game, essentially, i.e., like having dice prepared when asked for at the first scene, and being leveled up and all that kind of stuff. That's part of pacing too, because that's kind of like the crew behind the wings and like lighting and all that stuff. Like you have to have that shit done to have proper pacing in game as a player and GM as well.
Absolutely. Nothing is worse than a GM getting ready, kind of giving the little introduction and getting everybody kind of switching over gears, to then have a player say, "Oh, wait a second, I didn't level." And the immersion and the momentum that's being built comes to an immediate stop. So,
Yeah, and in that case, that player doesn't level up.
right? Yeah. So, oh, you didn't level up well, then you'll have to wait till the end of the session, maybe. That's a great point. Okay, so the second part to that question, they were semi-related, comes from Lloyd Collins. And he asks, when you rely on players to set the pace of your game, how can you encourage them to move things along?
Carrots in the game from their backstory, or maybe from stuff that you can kind of ascertain about their character or the player even, or sticks, as in threats and plots and latent things that you've devised as part of your GM responsibility that can be used to move players along. Someone's floundering or lagging, or dragging their feet, then as a natural consequence and a dramatic consequence, you can add stuff in that's being worked on by people outside of the party. And now the villain's plans come to fruition, or that raid that you've had in your back pocket will be done here. And it doesn't deal with the problem of the floundering in the long term, but it does kind of jolt the player and the party out of a scene that might be lacking in pacing in that way. And everyone usually, except me, I guess, likes a good fight. and then that usually brings some stimulus or conversation or change in circumstance, which might give the next "what do we do next" a bit more oomph and direction to get it going. So that's how I deal with players. Obviously, it's easier said than done because plural players, you've got to kind of do that on a couple of levels. But that's what I would do, say, before something like an out of game discussion about players that need to move pacing along when they have kind of the temporal agency, like when the GM's not dictating that, like they might say in a one shot, where it's kind of assumed the DM has the right to railroad many things, especially at the start of the adventure, to set it up at a pace in which it can be finished. And I think that's kind of, everyone knows that and signs up for that.
Absolutely. Even me, who runs games, who are typically a lot more action focused and a lot more action oriented. There's a stark difference between the way that I run one shots versus the way that I run campaigns. And it's very much comes down to largely pacing. That's probably the largest difference.
Yeah, that is the key. Like that is the major difference between a one shot and a campaign. Pacing.
Yep. And
you have to be starting like about to face the threat and
absolutely.
knowing all of the stuff, and like already be on the road not looking for it, and know this about the thing to set up enough context that you can have momentum without it feeling just like a roller coaster. Like it still means something if you have the right amount of context, but it all relies on the pacing as far as differing a one shot from a campaign.
Yep. It's put your bib on, you're about to get a big spoonful of exposition, and then we're going straight into action. That's my favorite way to kick off a one shot. Is this is the context of what's happening, and the shit is already in the fan, and you guys have to take care of this. So we're on the first steps of doing that. You're at the gates of outside the castle. You're in the ship on the way to the planet where this thing is all going down. Yeah, absolutely. Get things started. And when you start things that way, I found it like you said, it jolts the players into activity instead of there being that awkward, our characters need to introduce themselves to each other and we need to kind of work out who plays what role. It kind of forces everybody out of that mindset and gets people into immediate action.
Yep, narrows their focus, and it pretty much puts the emphasis on the players to use what camera or like spotlight they get in that kind of fast-paced kind of intro setting to describe themselves through action and choice, rather than my character is such and such old and he was born down in this place and then did a whole bunch of mad shit here and blah, 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 blah. Instead of that, it's like in the first 3 rounds of combat in this scenario that you present, the player describes who they are and what they're about by the descriptions of their movement and choices and expressions and what they say in that combat, and in that way that a player can say like so much with so little words, and it sits in nicely with that fast-paced, punchy, and like scene that still has context.
Yeah, it's the old additive, or the show not tell. It's definitely the don't tell me who your character is, show me who they are. By, like you said, their actions and the way that they do things, the what they say. And it's a fantastic point because that's 100% true. Characters who are developed that way are infinitely more interesting.
Yeah, that's right. For me, and generally I agree with that. That's the case. I would rather be introduced gradually, like in an impressionistic way, to a character that I'm going to invest in, than reading about them like a history assignment that I then have to like factor in all of that, which at the end of the day, like it's more enjoyable for me if it's leaked in that punchy fashion.
Yeah, I agree 100%. And as far as the kind of ways to get lethargic players kind of kicked into gear, similar to what you were saying, the sticks, the threats. I heard somebody one time say, when in doubt, blow something up. So like if there's a part where you just don't know what to do, the door falls in and people rush into the room, meaning harm to the party. There's a literal explosion and the wall caves in or whatever, but again, it jars people out of that lull of discussion or like picking something apart ad nauseum into, we can't talk about this right now, we have to do something.
It's essential.
Okay. So another of the talking points that I wanted to touch on is that pacing it's a strange thing to translate at times, especially within the context of the game. A combat could take an hour to play through, yet it covers just mere seconds of time within the game world. Adversely, months or even years, like we talked about earlier, could elapse in a single sentence. So I think thinking of time more as a fluid instead of a timeline is an incredibly strong tool as a GM. But what are some ways that you can play with time in order to facilitate the telling of a story at the table?
Flashback is a great one of messing with time to get the story done, whether it be like a focus on a character or a flashback focus on the party. It's a great way to color in foundations and elements of the story to give context to the current scene that you're about to go to, or will start up with next session, or however you choose for your format of session. But it's important to use, I think, that aspect for any kind of campaign of decent length, especially if the campaign itself is not going to cover a decent amount of time, like in game, that you'd use flashback and skipping about with time to facilitate storytelling at the table. It also gives onus to the player to color in elements of the story, and you don't have to as a DM, which is great. Lazy DM is the way to be. Like, just give it all to the players to do, and they want to do it anyway. And so when you like flashback to a scene that somehow might be relevant to the current thing at hand, and you've presented or got what you as a DM need out of the scene, then the players has this great opportunity to color in the past and give context to the present, and maybe even set up some tenets or fundamentals for the future, or maybe inject revelation or like memories in there. Like, there's a whole kind of host of stuff you can do by messing with time. And I agree, like, yeah, you should think of the time of a game as fluid as far as like what you can do narratively with it, rather than a timeline. Though ultimately, I still keep a chronological timeline of a game of any kind of temporal significance to help keep it together for me in my head, more with what other like NPCs are doing than anything. But yeah, on that vein, you could use dreams too. Like, and I use dreams all the time, and they're kind of a different thing because they're kind of like flashbacks in time, but they're not. And you can introduce subconscious information to them. You can like put a mirror up to the player. You can give a bit for the player to give like a mental soliloquy and all these like weird things that you can do there, especially at like the start of a session, like where I like to use them. And then have them be woken up and brought into the present by a messenger type figure that just gives them it's dawn, my lord, or the sun has risen, or it's nearly dinner. You're messing with time, using it for like narrative effect for the player, and then like rushing them into a full or a decent understanding of what time they currently are in, that they will now interact with consciously. And I would use dreaming and flashbacks way more and more often than flash forwards. Kind of think they hem you in a bit. If you flash forward something and it's set, it's kind of like it's written in stone, and then it forces other tenets of the current time to align to that, which maybe I'd use and maybe I have used, but if so, it would be sparingly and probably wouldn't mess with that. I did see an Andrew Knapp. He's a master. He runs a mean game. Back in the day, run a sci-fi game where the two players got ambushed in an alley and shot by this shady alien before jumping back in time 3 days to sitting opposite a desk with the shady alien, cutting out a deal to work for him. And they played the whole one shot knowing that was going to happen, and they ran with it, and it was excellent. But I think that's an exception, not a rule, as far as using flash forwards. Like, he used it definitely, and they were mad on board with it. But it wouldn't be like a regular tool in the arsenal for me, though I think it can be used to great effect when done deftly and sparingly. But yeah, dream and flashback is great. Great way to start a scene. Lloyd does it too, and does it excellently. It's probably who I stole it off. It's where if I have anything, I've stolen it off him. So it's ironic that he'd ask a question of this, actually, because my answer would be the same as his, ripped off him. But that's neither here nor there.
Yeah, and I could not agree more. Flashbacks and dreams are both things that I do tend to use a lot. And dreams are really fun, like you said, because nothing is set in stone with it. Even if it is a premonition of something in the future, it doesn't have to come to pass, or it doesn't have to come to pass in the way that they understood it back in that moment. And you can play with allegory and metaphor and symbolism and all kinds of things that you don't have to explain. And to a degree, you don't even really have to feel that many questions about it, because it's fleeting. It was a dream. But then later on, you can draw that through thread, kind of through everything else that happens afterwards. And then at the end, there's a big reveal, and they go, oh, okay. So now it all ties together. Yeah. I love that kind of stuff.
I started doing that after I watched The Sopranos for like the millionth time in my games, and basically formatting like dream scenes the way that is done there, where it kind of has so much surreal stimulus and stuff that could be connected or couldn't be, that's in there, that it's indelible enough that when events transpire later on down the track, naturally characters attach meaning to it. Kind of people want to do that to resolve it. It's an oddity. And so even if you don't as the DM do it, like if you're lazy like I am, the players will eventually like do it if the stimulus is like, it leaves a mark on them. Like if the dream scene leaves enough of a mark on them, they'll eventually attach meaning to the stimulus that's there, if they're good players and if they're invested.
Very true. Yeah. And keeping yourself open as a GM to when your players do that kind of thing, whenever they give a second look to the strange creature and insert some kind of meaning that you didn't intend, you as a GM should latch onto that and feed it. Do what you can to make that grow and encourage it, because then it could become a really strange and interesting motivation for that character.
And yeah, like I said before, content for you that you don't have to buy or steal or spend time thinking up. And I'm of a big opinion that like players generally, like especially in a campaign play, like will come up with so much stuff that you kind of you want to honor what they do come up with, because you need it. Like if you're gonna go in for the long haul and run a 15 games campaign or something like that, you want to respect the work that you don't have to do, that they do for you, and honor and listen to it and like run with it and make it a thing. If they've taken the time to present it to you, that's great. That's 2 hours that you don't have to do on Sunday afternoon, that you can play a game. Play a game. There's the question of the fucking century, Jeremy. What does it mean to play a game?
Well, luckily I get the opportunity to do both. I'm very, very thankful for that, because I limited myself to only 2 online campaigns at once that I'm running. And then I'll do like a one shot or 2, maybe a month. And I only play, I only run my games once a month. So that gives me plenty of time to work on them without feeling overloaded most of the time. But playing, on the other hand, I do have to admit that, especially with online gaming, I got myself in way, way too deep. My schedule became very hectic. And it stressed me out a lot before I started to kind of mete out how often I was able to actually play. So it's a good problem to have.
Maybe.
So a couple of points that I wanted to bring up about that last talking point about time kind of staying fluid is you need to be able to give yourself permission. And this is a strange phenomenon, but I've noticed that a lot of players and GMs have to kind of think about it this way. You have to give yourself permission that it's okay to jump forward or to stop and savor a moment and really make the time fit your needs, as opposed to feeling like you have something to answer for to time, if that makes sense. This is something that the movie Arrival does to phenomenal effect. If you haven't seen it, I highly recommend that you go and watch it. It will give you an entirely different perspective on how to tell a story in a non-linear fashion.
Yeah, that's a great film. I've ripped elements of that off shamelessly before, and I'd echo and agree with what you said.
Yep, and plus it's just a really good movie. I highly recommend you watch it.
That's kind of like what we were talking about before, like the premonitions, so to speak, without giving too much away about the film. If you haven't seen it, but like the premonitions and prophecy or whatever you want to call it, that element of it is always like vague and deft enough that it kind of never really corrals the movie, nor is it like so contrived enough that by the end it feels like a Deus Ex Machina. It's like a fine balance there, which I think is the key to those elements that you spoke of about Arrival. Like if you were to use them and translate them into a game, it'd be all about balance for my mind, to use those elements of flash forward and time not being linear, but coming instead coming full circle, so to speak.
Yeah, and it is a very difficult line to walk. It's hard. It's hard when doing that kind of stuff, and I think that's why dreams work so well as handling that, is because you can be super strange and vague, and you layer on symbolism, even again if you don't intend to do anything with it later on. If you bury it in enough kind of scratch your head, what the hell stuff, then it leaves it very open to interpretation, and it could end up going anywhere later on down the road. Another point that I wanted to make on the time is try to think in moments as opposed to minutes or hours or days. A scene really needs to encapsulate a moment in time, however long that needs to be, instead of it being a set amount of time. I think that's a really important thing to kind of try to understand.
Yep, I agree. I don't think I would think of scenes or encounters or interactions in that way, in like a metered way. For me, like the scene is fleeting, and it is, yeah, like you say, about the moment usually. And if a time, say an hour or day or something like that, had to pass, then I would ask what people wanted to do in that moment, and then hand wave it across, seeking, like I guess you're intimating, for the next moment, the next thing of import, and move time along. In campaign, you can be lax in a way with this, or gentle, but in a one shot, you just have to be rigid, like pretty much always like ching, pushing it onto the next thing, ching, pushing it onto the next thing.
Yeah, it's almost like a shot clock in chess. Like you got to finish what you're doing and then hit the clock, move it on. Whenever a one shot is concerned. And yeah, I mean, like one of the things that I did, I ran an Asian campaign for my home group, and in the world where that takes place, and where the players were at, their winters are very harsh. So it came to a certain point where winter set in during the game, and I told them, okay, you're going to have to winter wherever you are at this point. You're going to be stuck essentially for 3 months worth of nothing to do. You can't continue to chase this lead that you're following or really do much about that. Everything's going to be kind of on hold because life is pretty much on hold in certain parts of the world whenever winter hits. And that gave us a nice little breather because it was very much the doom's clock is ticking and the world's coming to an end. So it gave all of the characters a nice change of pace to be able to just have 3 months of downtime to not do anything.
Yep. Yeah, and you can make as much or as little as that as you want as a party, as a player, as a GM. A player might say, I'll do nothing but prepare, or a short, sharp response to what they want to do. And that's great. That's fine. Someone else might give a whole heap of stuff that they want to do, and that's great too. Either way, it's content that you don't have to generate, and it's probably going to be more interesting for them than anything you create out of a vacuum for them anyway.
Definitely.
Fun to do that.
Yeah, I think it's a very good thing to have in your little utility belt, in your tools as a GM, to be able to call on. Again, maybe not all of the time, but certainly rotate through it, through your usual bag of tricks, if you will. And not all timing even has to work the same for every player at the table. You know, you may have a character who, if the player is, following this or whatever, who maybe becomes pregnant and has a child. And, obviously that expands over months of time. And not all of the other characters would be dormant or idle during that time. But you can cover all of that with the same amount of table time. And just make sure that you give each person the opportunity to, like you said, establish what they wanted to do with that time window. Okay.
In a campaign, you have to do that every so often, I would hazard to say, or I would go so far as to say. There comes a point in like campaigns where maybe 2 or 3 times a campaign, you have to do that. And it's a good way to give people avenues to expend their resource or power or whatever it is that they've garnered over the time that's transpired in game.
Yeah. And it's a really good way to work with player absences. You have somebody who can't make it for a particular session, but it's the only time that everybody can get together and play, so you decide to go ahead and play anyways. Okay, well, so-and-so received a missive that their father was dying. So for the interim, they've gone home to deal with things, and they'll come back whenever the player's back at the table. It doesn't always work, depending on where you're at in a story arc of a campaign, but there's a lot of times when that kind of stuff can be applied with just a little bit of tweaking here and there.
For sure. Yeah, you have to roll with the punches, especially when you're kind of knee deep already into a campaign and there's player absence that has to, and there's going to be player return where you have to narratively kind of shuffle it all to make sense and to factor it. And if by that means you have to give the players time to transpire to downtime in, I think more often than not, players are going to want to color that in and go for their life with it. I certainly would. Like, I love to be asked, what do you want to do for the next 3 months? I got a list as long as your leg, Jeremy, of what I want to do in the next 3 months. So,
yeah, it seems like in real life, there's never a shortage of things that you want to do or need to do.
That's right.
So why would it be any different for your D&D character? Yeah, it's a great point.
Only because I guess like pervasive trait for me in reality is laziness, and my new characters are the opposite. I embody that unreality or that fantasy. So yeah, I guess the answer to that rhetorical question would be the character is way busier.
Yeah, the characters certainly get up to more interesting shit than I do. That's for sure.
I've never been too badly burnt.
Yeah, that's very true. My characters have never had to put in baseboards in the house. So there's a little bit of envy, maybe. All right, on to some more preloaded questions. and I am going to butcher the pronunciation of this name. I just know that I'm going to. But this one comes from Todor Terziev. He says, since pacing is quite relative, some want to play high-packed actions, others like spending a session in the market. How is this handled in the land down under, apart from getting drunk and having a good brawl? And then he asks, I believe this is a football question. Also, does the current Ajax seem a little more mature, and did Frankie and Mathis move a little too soon?
I think Frankie de Jong moved at just the right time, and his record and team has proven that. Matthias might move prematurely, though I think he'll has the skill to go on. Anyway, I am surprised to see and to agree with you, Toto, that Ajax are seeming a more mature outfit, even though they lost their work engine and their captain. But here we are. I think that Dolberg was right to be thrown on the altar of sacrifice for Quincy Promise, who's proved to be integral to that maturity. As for pacing in the land down under, usually it would be beer and pretzelies, because beer is like intrinsic to our culture and society, in which case it's usually bloated and lags and combats and scenes go on, and so it takes 8-hour game days to play a one-shot in a shed. So I'd say, and answer your question shortly, that pacing's done poorly down here, and that I'm probably an exception to the rule generally as far as DM tables go. Like online, I guess you'd say the same, Jeremy. We play 3.5 hour games, maybe more, maybe less. Down here, that's not really the case. So I'd say pacing's an issue. If the idea of an 8-hour session to you sounds like hell, then pacing's an issue in Australia. If, like me, you will consent to 8 hours of that, then the pacing's just fine.
It's actually not all that different here. Our sessions on a weekly basis are 6+ hours. And again, it's a lot more casual. There's people get up to get drinks and snacks, and we chat about the latest movies and shows.
Brawl and mate like we do, and drink and then go back to the table.
Exactly. It's like Valhalla. We just fight all day and drink all night. It's a good social activity. That's one of the things that I don't think gets scratched as often in online gaming. And obviously with online gaming, you have the side chat, which is where most of the socialization takes place. But it's a crucial part of playing face-to-face for me. The kind of rubbing elbows and making jokes and, doing it, while the GM is explaining something important, cutting the funny on the side just to get a giggle out of somebody who's not directly involved in what's going on. Like that's part of the game for me. And I would hate to play an 8-hour game without that.
Yep. I hate that stuff in a online game because it's half as long. But I note that it's essential in a long game. But that's a benefit, and this is, I guess, out of the realm of our conversation. But I will add that online game chat, that is a channel where all of that side effect stuff of game can be channeled positively and in a way that never harms. That's too strong a word. That never fucks with the game.
From what's going on. And that is different because, again, at a table for me whispering something to the person sitting next to me more than likely is not going to be heard by anybody but them. And if we get a little chuckle and giggly, we keep it under wraps. It's usually not a big deal. It's not going to disrupt what's happening elsewhere at the table where the main focus is between the GM and whoever else. But when you're online, anytime you talk, your microphone switches over to you and they hear you just as loud as they hear the people they're supposed to be focusing on. And then it is very distracting.
But I think generally, and more often than not, people, like your average player of the game, is very aware of that and muting and things like that, and respectful of I guess this is about time, sort of. The time invested, not so much the hours of online game, but the Kaises who stay up to ridiculous o'clock in Spain, or the Lloyds who run games until dawn. Like, it's not the 3 hours that people are giving in online games that's kind of like the currency, so much as it is what they're sacrificing after or before the games to coordinate it at times that make it doable for everyone. And I think generally people, like players, observe that and are conscious of that in online games and in the online community greater.
Yeah, it's certainly something that I try to be aware of and respectful of. I am definitely the kind of person that cuts up, but I try to keep it in context and in character, because that is, like you said, that's respectful, in my opinion. It's not respectful to bring the game to a halt because you have a rules argument, or because you want to talk about something in your personal life that has nothing to do with what's going on in the game. I think respect does have a large part to do with that.
Yep. Yeah, for sure.
Awesome. Okay. Speaking of Caius, he has 2 questions.
He always has so many questions.
He does, and they're good. They're really good. He asks, any tips for speeding up a long-winded talker?
That's a tricky one. That's a real tricky one. Because you don't want to be insensitive or preclusive. But then, in the context of an online game, you also want to fuck with 3 other people's time at 10 a.m., 10 p.m., and 4 a.m. So it's kind of like goes back before, like we said, about balance, and also goes back about respect. And I guess part of the responsibility is on the player too, to be self-aware. You have to be self-aware in an online game. You have to be self-aware of when your webcam's on or not, or when your mic's on or off, like of that you've got your dice ready, all of that other stuff. And this is part of it. And if you're about to give a soliloquy and you don't know what you're saying, don't give the soliloquy. If you're about to give wide-reaching commands or like respond to some like caustic, abrasive comment, and you can't form it, then like add to the story and drama by saying that your character is wordless, or such and such. And when you have it formed and when you have it moderately winded instead of long-winded, then bring it in. That's a kind of cheap answer to the question he asked, because it's like, what does the GM do about it? Like, what do I do about it? And I would rudely, I guess, like after a moment, be like, yep, come on, yep. And like start to have other characters, and sorry, not characters, other NPCs embody my like frustration or impertinence or whatever, and be like, spit it out, man, or something like that, and kind of seize the initiative off the player. I guess that's the true answer of what I would do, Caius. I would seize the initiative off the player. If it's getting to the point where I can imagine 3 other faces going, fuck me dead, I'll seize it and push the player on. I'm not saying that's what, I'm not here to say that's what other GMs should do, but that's what I would do. Yeah.
I think I would have the same exact approach. It's not, again, it's not just about any one character or any one player. Everybody there is dividing their time equally, ideally at least. And as the GM, it is definitely in part your responsibility to try to make sure that the pie is cut into even slices as much as you can. And if a player is not going to be aware of them taking too much, then you need to be. And sometimes as the DM, you have to be the bad guy out of character just as much as you do in character.
Yeah. Yeah, it's your responsibility. You have to do that so that it's, because the alternative is 2, 3, 4, whatever other players begin conspiration and angst and resentments and things like that build up in a game if the GM doesn't be the bad guy, like you say, when they need to be. It's just kind of part of your job. Like, you're the one who has to pull people into line or cajole people into the game or whatever the thing it is. It's part of your job as the GM. You have to do that.
Yep, you've got a lot of plates and you got to keep them spinning. And again, good players are going to help you do that.
That's it. Yep.
But even good players sometimes do things that they shouldn't. And usually a little slap on the wrist or, a little ushering along makes people kind of clue into, okay, I need to you know.
Yeah, for sure. The people generally who are players of games, especially the games I run, they're very cluey people, and so it doesn't even, I think, really need to be a conscious thing to have that self-awareness, engaging of other people, and then encourage people to kind of harvest a group of players who are like that. That communication is free flowing and is like a positive part of the group's dynamic, because essentially it's integral to have a campaign long term, that there's that conducive communication going on between the players and the sensitivity of themselves and of others.
Yep. And again, like you said, you don't have to bring a halt to somebody who's being loquacious with an out of character comment or jibe. You don't have to say, hey, it's time to wrap it up. You can have somebody in character, an NPC in the scene, say, okay, we've got things to do. It's been nice talking to you. We're going to go ahead and go now. Or as a GM, just say, while so-and-so is rambling on in the scene, what are your characters? How are you guys responding to this? You can see that some of the NPCs are starting to not pay attention or, nod off or have side conversations.
Yeah. Yep. That also gives the player time to form their words if they are struggling too. And you're adding to the game by setting more context, giving them a bit of a time to, fuck, what am I going to say? And then back to them. And then if nothing happens, though, if nothing's produced, then I'd encourage you to seize the initiative, certainly in a one-shot. Like if you've got 45 minutes left and you haven't had your last encounter yet and someone's yabbering on, tell them to shut up. Like one of the guards or peons tells them to shut up and you move on, because at the end of the day, like, you have to weigh it up as the GM at the end.
Yeah,
you have to factor in people's meta enjoyment as well. And you just have to be the bad guy. Like, it's your responsibility to do that, for instance, before another player. I think that'd be fair to say.
Yeah, I would agree. Because again, if a player is going to have an issue with meta animosity, then you should be taking that, not people across the table from each other.
Yeah, players have their jobs and responsibilities, and like they're part of the contract. So does the DM, and that part of it is the DM's responsibility.
Absolutely. Okay. Another personal question that I had for you, personal-ish, is, from what I've observed, there is no small amount of your particular talent that lies in your understanding of a setting. You seem to soak up history and lore, and you retain that information with a seemingly disarming ease. So your retention of minute detail is incredible, as is your command of language. Are you by chance a historian?
No, I wish. I failed a couple of history classes at university. That's about it. Like at an amateur level, I love it though, and I read history and like small, tiny, weird, obscure pockets of bits and pieces of history. I kind of get an obsession with and learn heaps about, but certainly not like an overarching like sense of it that I could call myself anything like a historian. My school, like in high school, like, we didn't have history at my school.
Really?
So whatever like bits that I've had for games where I can kind of on the spot remember this, how many men deep is a phalanx and weird shit like that. That's because of just like in free time, like reading into it and loving it, and reading history books and stuff, because I didn't really get it at school and I failed it at university. So yeah, definitely not a historian. My academic record proves that irrefutably.
See, I had the opposite problem. I had a lot of history courses throughout grade school, but the way that they teach history in school, typically, it was dry and boring. It was knowledge retention of names of places and dates, and that was pretty much it. You memorize this stuff and then regurgitate it. So it was lacking context, something that we've mentioned several times tonight. It was lacking that human element in a lot of ways. And as an adult, I have found a passion for learning about history and mythology now that I never had in school. Now, my knowledge retention is nowhere near what yours appears to be, but I do tend to latch on to trivial facts. Like, I don't usually memorize dates very well still. That's still very much a weak point for me. So a lot of times I have an issue telling you whether Marcus Aurelius or Caesar ruled first. I don't remember that kind of stuff very well. But I can tell you about these little weird, quirky things that happened between so and so and so and so on two different continents that has this one little strange connection to one another. That's the kind of stuff that I definitely latch onto.
Mm-hmm. Obscure minutia and like small moments or small things are just as essential as the big things for painting in a picture if you're trying to emulate a historical setting. Like the right date or like the particular pronunciation of the god or goddess or like the ensorcelment of the breastplate of the warrior you're speaking to. They're all as important as like what the grandmother's headdress looks like or like what kind of shoes that person would be wearing or things like that, as far as like getting feel of a historical given period or setting across to players.
Yeah, absolutely. And one of the reasons why I think I avoid games that are more historical reenactment is because of my uncertainty with a lot of the details, especially the details that are kind of taken for granted as being common knowledge. So I tend to shy away from that a little bit and take what I like about a culture or a historical point in time and extract what I think is usable, twist it, and make it fit usually a fantasy setting. Change what I want, have a little bit of artistic license in that regard, and not have to worry as much about the specific details.
That's the great thing about fantasy, I think, as like far as that aspect goes, that pre-existing, like stunningly interesting phenomena in culture exists to cherry pick and place into fantasy and erode or distort rules about that to make it interesting and steal the meaning and importance and power of the existing thing, and then handle it in a different way that's quicker and easier and not as reliant or compliant on historical knowledge and context. And that's, I think, what the massive draw card of fantasy and role playing and things like that is wider, because it takes the jaw dropping moments and plays with it and presents it to you kid, not some other hero. That's like an important aspect of it for me.
Absolutely, and it allows you to draw stronger parallels to contemporary topics and contemporary sensibilities.
Yeah, you talk about things roundabout in a safe way or in mirrored ways, and everyone knows, but no one's an accomplice directly because it's shrouded and it's kind of bubble wrapped in fantasy. And so it's a great way for a dude in Australia and a dude in America to play with in a role play setting a sensitive or interesting or confounding issue that does not have actual like social repercussion, and actually can be fun in the exploration of it, which is just a gem part of RPGs in general.
Absolutely. Yeah. Again, one of the things that we touch on quite a few times in other episodes of this series is how role-playing games are a practice space for socially sticky situations. You're able to practice feeling certain emotions and dealing with certain hardships that you may not have dealt with in your life yet, or that you may have dealt with in your life yet, or maybe not dealt with fully to the point of having closure. And they kind of give you the place to dive into those emotions or those experiences without having to actually relive or go through them with the typical consequences.
Yeah, and neatly, one of those consequences is the time invested, right? You can't go and worship fucking sacred texts of Pelor for 10 years and then do military PT for 3 years and then become a paladin. but you can spend 4 hours 4 times a year, like really getting kind of a nourishing, imaginative sense of what that might be, right? And
Yeah.
like time, pacing, like that's part of that. Knowing when to skip over the learning to ride a horse and reading the 15th annal of Pelor's will as written in 200 Dale Reckoning, and getting to the moral quandary of what do you do when you find your nemesis, but they're actually more a part of you than you previously thought, or whatever the interesting stimulus might be. Like that time is part of that investment and enjoyment too.
Well said. Very well said. Okay, some more questions that we have that are preloaded. Another one from Caius. Have you ever played around with expectations of time in games? He gives an example. Theric laughs at your insults and dismisses your oaths of revenge as he speeds off across the sky. But your words prove prophetic when you stumble across him at an alchemy supplier in the desert city of Shem 11 years later.
I like that in a Gonzo-ish way, and like Caius could probably get away with like running that, and I'd plod along. But I don't know if I mess around with time too much beyond the scope of flashbacks or dreams. That's the big one where I'll like use verisimilitude against the players, like making them think by what I've set up in the dream that this is a memory, until the weird, surreal, obscure, humiliating, intimidating, whatever thing that happens in it that cues them, say 8 minutes in, this is a dream. And so I've fucked around with the time, and then they realize that they don't know what time they're in. They don't know what day it is or how far it's gone since the last session, which when they get awoken by the messenger and the context giver, that I've messed around with time a couple of times before moving into the scene proper. That's probably as much, I think, as I consciously mess around with time like that with players, I think, in the context of what Caius is actually asking about.
Yeah, I think for me, it's something that if I would do it, it would be very sparingly, maybe a one-time thing. And it would have to depend largely on the group of players that I was doing it with. Because I can't even say that personally I wouldn't feel a little robbed if all of a sudden the game skipped forward 11 years and I wasn't really given the opportunity to develop what I was doing that entire time. That's a lot of time to kind of jump forward for me.
Yeah, I would protest too much in that situation and kind of bullishly state what I had done.
Yeah.
But I'm a pretty proactive kind of player. So even though I'd hate it, it wouldn't be an issue because I'd like challenge it, I think. And that would be the player's responsibility in that instance, rather than like resenting it or being pained by it without resolution. It's their responsibility to pursue one, and it's just as like it's your responsibility as the GM to listen to that, even if you don't agree with it or like it. Like you said before, we have to eat a bit of you didn't say it like that, but we have to eat a little,
It's very true.
Be part of it. But players don't like your decision of what you've done with time, and give them the opportunity to do something with it. If you don't, that's a point of contention.
Yeah, absolutely. And contention in character is fine. Like
it's essential.
Absolutely. And I think as a player and as a DM that it's imperative that you deal with what you're given. You don't backtrack and fight it. You deal with what you're given. You're given wet clay and you have to make something out of it. It may not always be to your liking, like you said. It may not be what you would prefer to be working in, but you've got to make it work so that the game progresses.
Mm-hmm.
If you have an issue, wait until the session is over, then address it.
Yep. There's so many avenues. There's never been more avenues for conflict resolution. And if you're talking in the realm of, say, like online games, which I guess is close to the center of our conversation, like we're talking about that, I think, more focused than, say, outside of online gaming. So it becomes very important to access all those channels, whether it be private chat, public chat, or just time outside of the game to communicate. Like, it's never been easy to be like, oh, hey, one sentence information to you. Take your time before you process that and give me one sentence back. It's as much or as little as you want to make of it, but it's kind of no excuse to not have communication when we have like digital ravens at our beck and call.
That is a drum that I beat all the time. Communication is the absolute essential key.
Yeah, I think I've heard you beat it. I think I've heard you
Every
beat that drum.
relationship. Yep.
Yeah.
Gaming relationship, romantic relationship, work relationship. It doesn't matter. You've got to have good communication if you want it to succeed. Plain and simple.
Maybe that's why I've had so many like successful online campaigns and very few successfully completed outside like IRL games. Like something usually always comes up, but in online games, because there's so much more avenue for communication that doesn't soak up game time. You know what I mean? You can get so much more done. Like I would hazard to say, you can get more done in a 3-hour session online than you could in an 8-hour session at the table, if with the right circumstances.
Yeah, a lot of that really does come down to group.
Dynamic and communication, yeah.
Absolutely. And how many of your players are long-winded players? If people really latch on to heavy role play and, you've put down, 3 different encounters or whatever, you're probably not going to get to all 3 of them. So you have to kind of, again, another thing that I've brought up before is you got to understand the psychology of your table as best you can. You got to know what makes your players tick and try to plan accordingly.
Yep. That's just part of it.
Yep. Okay. We have just a couple more preloaded questions, and then I have one.
What else does Caius want to know?
Caius is done. That's all of the ones that he had asked. However, the 2 that we have remaining are both from Tim Carney. So the first one that he asks is, how do you consider pacing whenever you're prepping?
I think he means mechanically. Like I will, on my Goog doc for that prep, I will usually have the players' names in a row, and I'll have key things that are going to be presented or happen to them, and make sure everyone has at least one. And then I will usually pick someone, ideally the person who wasn't kind of given an introspective last session, and have there be an intimate small moment, like intro scene of them, which is kind of slow and ideally mundane, and like kind of like a space for them to interact with NPCs to like characterize or humanize themselves. And then I'll ideally work to bring everyone together to a central item and give it enough impetus and like context and concern that like the players that I favor and like run my games for usually have an impetus that they will kind of set the pace that they want. So I guess like consciously I don't factor it too much, pacing that is, beyond that, because I rely on my players for it. Like lazily and luckily I rely on my players for it, but I definitely, even despite that, I still would factor for it a little bit because it's so important. But I think for me and probably for the majority, that pacing is something that's more accurately gauged and understood in the moment, like when your finger's on the pulse in the game, rather than predicting on paper. Like Tim's GM, you and me are GMs, we know predicting stuff on paper is the best way to hear the gods laugh, right? So you've got to have like your finger on the pulse in game. So I'd say in lieu of like preparing beforehand for pacing, it's more I just try and be aware if I can in the mire of everything of it in game, But yeah, I don't consider myself really good at pacing. I think it's a weakness. Like I've never completed a one-shot properly in under like 1,000,000 hours. And, I favor campaigns because I think a part of it is that I'm poor or could be better at pacing. Rob Coletta, to my mind, does pacing excellently. It's almost like he has a chess clock telling him. It feels kind of like it's been produced for something episodic. And the rhythm that whether he sets for himself or just feels within himself, is like what I think a good kind of high watermark of pacing is, where it's kind of like methodically factored in. That's probably the best way, like preparation wise, I think, for pacing. And I'm certainly not a good example of preparatory pacing, Tim.
I have the same problem with a lot of one shots. They either hit their mark or they turn into a 2-shot or a 3-shot sometimes. That's certainly happened more than once. And I don't think that I really overthink it very much because, like you said, it's definitely something that has to stay fluid. You have to be able to change it and do so quickly and adapt to whatever pace that your players are kind of setting for you. I do have a default that I kind of adhere to just so that I feel like I'm as prepared as I can be going into a session, and that's typically one encounter per hour. Doesn't have to be a fight, but one social encounter, one exploratory encounter, one combat encounter per hour is kind of the nice round basis that I typically start with. But like you said, it very rarely plays out that way. So it's a good idea to have an idea of where things might go beyond that, or at least be able to wing that in the moment.
Yeah, I think I've definitely found myself ruining missed opportunities to be nuanced with pacing in the moment, like retrospectively. Then I have rued not preparing it before the game in my Google Doc, factoring it in, I would say, because it is so like no, it's not effervescent, but it's like it's something that's best gauged in the moment rather than factored beforehand. There's too many variables, especially when you've got like sharp players or worse players with agency and resource. You kind of are a bit out of your depth as far as being able to predict kind of like temporal importance or like pacing beforehand when you have those like unknown quantities floating around.
It's very true.
Tried to stick to the one scene for an hour. I think Lloyd Collins would have shred through the film at the back and pushed on into the background and got something else done.
Very, very true. There are definitely players who will capitalize on an encounter and make it last, and then there are players who are the exact opposite, who will see your encounter, figure out exactly what they want to do, and head straight to the finish line. And it's not a way that you might have expected, but it's perfectly reasonable, logical, and it makes sense in the story and the narrative of what's going on. So then your prep work has been cut in half if you've spent a long time on it. That's it's tough to know how to walk that line, I think.
Yeah, I am that player, and send those players to me.
Yep. Okay, the last prepped question that we had from audience is also, like I said, from Tim. And he says, when I think of pacing issues, I generally think of them having to do with a game running too long. What do you do if a game should happen to run too short? While this could apply to online games, I think it's more directed at in-person games that people planned their day around, traveled for, etc.
Yeah, that's a real tricky one. Obviously, that's why a master of games is asking a question like it. It's hard because you've got to just stick to your priorities in a way, but also factor in all of the different players' priorities. And while one player might want to get that second encounter that she expects at this session that she drove an hour for to play for 5 hours, you've then also got to factor in the person who last session has been working on this scheme to come to fruition this session, but now you're looking down the barrel of not having enough time to do that thing for them. And through the myriad lens of all those different priorities you have to factor, you've got to like pick what's important and go with that, and then finish it, and then resolve the others at another time. That's what I would do anyway. Prioritize what's going to be the best for everyone that I can handle by making up for next session, and I would focus on that, whatever that particular priority thing is, resolve that, end it thereafter, and then pick up next session with the others, rather than say trying to rush them all in and give 3 players dissatisfying resolutions. I would rather give one player a satisfying resolution and make the other 2 wait. And if they don't, well, whatever, get more players. But that's how I would do it anyway. Tim's a lot nicer than me, so that advice is probably useless. Useless to him. He's probably looking for a more kind of balanced, moderate way of how to deal with that. But yeah, I don't really know. Like, if you've got time issues in a game like that where people have spent time and resource to get there, like at the table, for 6 hours, and you're starting to run out of time to get stuff done, it has to come down to those priorities. And like you said before, knowing your players, what's going to like worse for them. If it's going to like cause trouble, then that's the thing that you resolve. And then next time take up player B or C's prerogatives. I'd be interested to hear what answer he'd give to his own question.
Yeah,
of that, because it's a stumper. It stumped me. All the others I've kind of felt like, I think that's my answer for that, but for this one I'm dissatisfied at my answer.
Well, like I have certainly had evenings that wrapped up way sooner than I had expected them to. But again, it comes down to the table's temperature. Like if you get to the point where you've finished what you had prepped, and it feels like you're kind of done for the evening, but everybody still seems really into what's going on and they don't really want to quit, or God forbid, ask them, do you guys want to keep playing?
Yeah.
Then figure out what to do next. Like there should be something that's always going to happen next.
Sure. One thing with for me, it's not if I'm running out of time before I can get everything done, that's a problem for me. But if I finish everything short, that's not a problem for me or the players. It shouldn't be a problem for anyone. If everyone at the table is hyped and in character and ready to rock and roll, and you've finished your content that you can present to them, just simply ask them what they want to do. And if they're good players and they're hyped and they're equipped and they've got one bloody hit point, they'll go nuts and do stuff. So I think in the instance of if you've finished early, simply ask, what do you want to do next? And guaranteed, if you've got good players, you'll have more on your plate than you bargained for, as far as content to finish off the extra hour and 15 minutes to make good on the time that everyone's put aside to be there and is expecting 4, 3, whatever hours it is, that the expectation of game time at the table. I kind of want to give it to them. That being said, if a game finishes half an hour early, something like that, well, let's just finish the game and shit talk. But if it's a significant portion, like if it's 1/3 of the game time, you owe it to them to be on the pulse with their content and their background and their goals and motivations. And you just dredge something from that and boom, you've got an encounter, You've got a thing they desire. It's your job to put stuff in the way of it. And improv and prepping on the fly, that's something as a GM you have to learn to do if you can't do it. And stopping a game because you run out of content or whatever, when people, especially in online games, I know that Tim's talking about outside of life games, but there's still compromises that people make to make them as well. In the context of that, if you don't have enough content that you promised, that people committed to, you owe it to them, their time. Reclaiming my time. You owe it to them to give them stuff, to give them content from that. And if you don't resolve it, fine, you can resolve it next time, right? There's always a next time if people are reasonable. That's more preferable as far as I'm concerned, than being resigned to having it. Well, the pace was excellent, actually, and all that time I factored that you guys would waste time or that we'd lose time. Didn't happen, and now we've resolved everything and have got new content. That doesn't cut it at this stage in the game. If if you're listening to YouTube videos about doing DMing stuff, well, take this. You've got to improv stuff in the moment when you run out of content. It's not a good enough excuse to stop the session, considering that 3, 4, 5, whatever people are making the time to be there. It's a valuable thing that needs to be honored, and learning how to improv to fill it is part of our responsibility.
I agree. I think improvisation probably needs to be your sharpest tool as a GM. It's something you're going to rely on the most.
Unless it's a crew who wants dungeon delve and modular stuff, and that's cool. If people want that, I respect that. I wouldn't mind that occasionally around the drinking table, but it wouldn't be my go-to all the time. But unless you're doing something like that where it's very kind of rigid, modular, and kind of crawling, then yes, you need to be constantly interested in and invested in being better at your improv. You need it, straight up.
And it's one of those things where, and I differ from a lot of other GMs in this way. I tend to have a pretty clear idea of where I at least think or where I'm kind of aiming the kind of arc of the story, where it's kind of headed. I don't try to override player agency when I can, but I typically have a point where I want to land, and most of what I'm doing is trying to get in that direction, taking into account what the players are doing and what they're changing, and how that's going to affect how off the mark I am in the end. So that ends up leaving me a pretty good idea of where to start improvisation if I have to fill time like that. I'm like, I know where I want to go, and this is where we are right now. So I can kind of see a bridge that heads in that direction. So that's what we're going to start doing.
Opportunity, rather than it's kind of like a problem. You know what I mean? Well, that's how I perceive it anyway.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. And because usually the interesting thing is not this beat that you came up with or this point from a person's backstory. It's how these two things are connected to each other. It's the bridge that exists between those 2 points where all of the juicy stuff comes from. That's where the focus really needs to be, in my opinion.
I would agree with that.
Fantastic. Okay, man, I have one more point that I kind of wanted to get to, and then I will be done monopolizing your time. So the last point that I wanted to bring up is, and this is perhaps a little bit ancillary of a topic to pacing, but I want to talk about non-sequential scenes. We've kind of touched on it a little bit, but I think that a common trap that many people fall into is thinking about their story, the story of their game, in a linear fashion. The campaign begins with a certain starting point, and everything that happens in the game is in chronological order. But we talked about flashbacks and flash forwards a little bit, and they're both incredibly common storytelling devices in other media. But what function, if any, do you feel that these devices play? What about them is potentially important? And how can you implement them to help with your pacing?
You can implement them to help with your pacing, like as you need them in the moment. That requires that you have thought about them or prepared about whatever the flashback or dream will be beforehand and kind of have it in reserve. But that's kind of ideally when you would slip it in. As far as like it pertains to pacing, you'd want to, when the moment calls for it, have it there ready to insert, to kind of give more context to your session or that particular scene. I wouldn't say use a flash forward on the spur of the moment to change up pacing if there were things you hadn't factored about, like what's going to happen with this, that, and the other if I go forward a month. But if you have thought about it and have all that kind of prepped and or pass muster in your mind, then I don't see why you shouldn't use that as a device as well, like the flash forward. But for me, the best way to use like temporal storytelling devices is like at the start of a session, and midway. And midway is a good way to kind of dictate the pacing and more importantly, mood and tone of like the next thing that's going to happen. Like after a break, we'll start up with something, some kind of time shift or kind of stuff that's kind of gone by, and then reorientate from there with that new point of story. But as far as like devices for helping with pacing, then like temporal ones aren't your best option, I think. Combat, urgent news, or like revelations, or just simply a new tangent are probably better ways. So as far as like the wording of your question, that's the place, or that's the importance of temporal like devices like flashbacks as it pertains to pacing. As secondary things you might use to alter the pacing to like, combat, news, revelations, other things. So they play a role, but maybe it's more secondarily or like a secondary role, or at least it is for me when pacing's an issue. It wouldn't be my go-to to have temporal, like to employ temporal devices. I more use them for like establishing tone and mood at the start or midway or both of a session.
I think it's a really fantastic point about it almost being like a shift in gears. You're using that as like a palate cleanser. We've kind of been going like this, and now we're going to break it hard, take this kind of tangent, and that gives us a different platform to then go forward in a different way, in a different direction. I think that's a really, really good point.
It works on a meta level or like an abstract level too, right? Because usually like a scene will end halfway through one of my sessions. We'll all debrief for like a minute, talk shit, and then go off to have a coffee, smoke, whatever, disperse. So when it comes back to you, like I'd rather use a temporal device to orientate or to like establish mood or tone than I would to say up or alter the pacing. That's where it sits for me with the sweet spot.
Yep. And I can agree as well with the point of using them in the beginning. Especially, I'm a big fan of using them at the very beginning of a campaign. I really like using flashbacks as a way of giving the players a lot of exposition about kind of what's going to be happening, what the scope of the story might be. And I think a lot of the time, what's a fun experiment that I've done a couple of times, and I've loved it every single time that I've done it, is in these exposition scenes, these expository scenes, have your players take on roles of characters that are not their PCs, that may not even be anything more than barely attached to your PCs. But there could be a follow-through for the story of the campaign. Lay the groundwork with heroes that came way before your characters were even born, or ancestors of theirs, or on and on and on. I'm a big fan of using them in that way.
Yeah, it's a good use of time because and like Lloyd does it very well as well, and he did it well at the start of our Mir campaign. He employed that technique to give us context and exposition, but in the guise or illusion of a character's flashback, like it was my character's. But when you look at it abstractly, he was actually giving us everything we needed to lead effectively into scene one after the intro scene without it feeling like an intro scene at all. And like that subtle like use of it adds to players feeling more in the moment, because it's not like the old movies where like there's drums and trumpets and then heaps of like shitty text comes up telling you all about like the state of things. You're learning it by what characters are feeling and thinking about, and like how that is affecting their choices at the start of a campaign, which sets like the tone and mood of not only like the scene or like or the whole thing long term, but just the players individually too. It allows them a chance for that. So it's a great way to do it. Like I'm all about killing two birds with one stone. And if you can do two scenes in one scene, do one scene, And it's great for everyone. The character on focus gets a flashback, and the players who are all listening, who are essentially audience members at this stage, gain all the context they need to drive their characters when it's like, okay, character B, what are you doing? Character C, what are you doing? They have all of the meta knowledge they need without having to ask questions or be given their own separate exposition. And yeah, obviously, if like to go back to what we said before about one shots, if you're in a one shot type situation, you definitely want to do that. You always want to condense if you can. And rather than having a scene where the king's steward tells you this thing, and then a scene where he comes to you and then tells you this other thing in secret so that the king doesn't know thereafter, well, in a one shot, you wouldn't have the first scene. You would just infer it through exposition while you're giving flashback to a character that leads directly into the scene one. And it's more nuanced and it's swifter. And if that's what pacing's about, right? When to be swift and when to not.
Yeah, brevity is an essential tool. Knowing when to be curt and to the point is just as crucial as being able to improv a lengthy scene. It comes down to pacing and understanding pacing. There's something that's very, very freeing also about having a scene where, okay, you're about to sit down and play this one particular character in a campaign for who knows how long. It could be a year, maybe two. having an opportunity to kind of step outside of this character that you're going to spend so much time with and play something that is radically different, play a character that's totally different. It allows you to kind of free up, get things out of your system as a player, I think. And it's there was a thing that I did at the beginning of the Asian campaign that I mentioned before. Each of the players had to choose one of two clans that they were a part of. And the split ended up being fairly evenly divided between these two clans. And what I did was I had a separate short session for each of those two groups before we actually started the first full session of the campaign. And each of those groups played through a legend of an artifact being lost. But they played through it from the point of view of the ancestors of their clan. So the Ram clan players played through the loss of this artifact as ancestors of the Ram clan, and the Crane clan did the same thing. But both of them were presented as being truth, even though what happened in those sessions was vastly different. And what ended up happening is in the Crane clan's reminiscent of the memory, if you will, the Ram clan was the bad guys, and vice versa. And the way that I justified that was that this is the legend of how this artifact was lost that has been passed down through the ages in your clan. Naturally, your clan's the good guys, and the other one is the bad guys. And so it had this great built-in animosity between the two clans, each kind of blaming one another for the loss of this great artifact. And that great artifact obviously came back later in the campaign and played a major pivotal role in what was going on. That kind of stuff is really fun, and it takes the stakes kind of out of what you can do with the scene, because you can kill the characters and the player's not going to get to the point where they're like, well, that was a waste. It's have a TPK, but it's meaningful to the story of what's going to happen later on, and the players get the chance to kind of live it up big before they get entrenched in playing a character for a long time.
Yeah, that's a cool thing. I've never done, I think, anything really like that, but I can see the allure and like good purpose of that. Yeah, it's kind of like refreshing, and it gives a different perspective, and it also, as far as like for that particular example you gave with the idea of creating that animosity or like kind of giving that biased context, having the players play through that is always going to be more evocative and more compelling for them as far as like aligning to that animosity than if you simply tell them Toad Clan is enemy and they're like, me hate Toad Clan. If they've like meta played through as another character of House Crane, creating this myth and like lived through that betrayal or whatever it was that gave them this is the source of the animosity, they're going to harbor it better as a player for their new character, which is going to make it way more interesting, because like we said before, like contention is essential. Like you need contention for there to be tension.
Very true. The game is built around conflict. Whether or not that's combat, that's just, that depends on the table, but you have to have conflict.
If it's descended to combat, then you have failed.
Yep. The first weapon was invented to allow unreasonable men to remain unreasonable.
I've never heard that, but I blue thumb it.
All right, man. Well, Nico, this has been awesome, dude. Thank you very much for coming on and chatting with me. Thank you for having me. It's been a good conversation. Absolutely. I love talking shop. It's one of the reasons why I started doing this. I do much better in one-on-one conversation than I do in a group conversation. So I really like finding people in the community to kind of hone in on a specific topic and just kind of chop away at it and get to know the person that I'm talking with a little bit better. A lot of people I get the chance to play with on a pretty regular basis, but again, there's not a lot of time for socialization usually. So this is a good way for me to kind of get both of those at once. Mm-hmm. Yes, similar for myself.
And it's always good to kind of talk about stuff like this and walk away with changed perceptions about what you think should be the good thing to do, whether it's from like hearing it from you or hearing myself say it. It's good to keep your finger on the pulse, I guess, with how your skills should evolve, with the game mastering. So it's a good good byproduct of these conversations that you hold, and I'm happy to be here. Thanks for having me.
Absolutely. Yeah. If you ever stop learning, then you're going to stagnate. And that's just as true with DMing and playing as it is about anything else in life. You should always be looking for fresh perspectives, different angles. And that's another point of doing these things is I get to dive in with somebody who has a very different approach to this particular topic, and glean information for myself that could be useful down the road. So,
yeah, stealing from each other is an essential part of RPGs. Absolutely. So it was good to thieve you, my lord.
It was my pleasure. And thank you, anybody who may have tuned in this evening and watched along with us live. I appreciate it very, very much. For anybody who may be tuning in the future, I appreciate that as well. If you like what you see, hit the like button, subscribe, stick around. There's a lot of other stuff on the channel, mostly live plays, but there's plenty of other help action videos, as well as some other crafting videos and other videos where I talk about different ideas in the RPG realm, arena, whatever you want to call it. But just 2 more months till the end of the year. And I already have both of my guests planned for the rest of the year. So I'm looking forward to having both of those gentlemen on. So stay tuned. And until next time, may your dice roll high and your snacks always be within reach.